Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Just welcome you to this lessons from Lake Malawi Fisheries Governance in the colonial-era. My name is Nasim, Vadalia, and the Communications and Engagements Lead at Scotland Malawi Partnership. I'll shortly pass on the mic to Tracy, to our chair, who is Tracy Morse. And just before we do that, for those joining us online, just a reminder that you have to remain muted until you're asked to speak, and you're free to introduce yourself as well in the chat box. Just let us know who you are and where you're from. And just to also let you know as well that this meeting is being recorded, and all everything else that we record and the pictures that we're going to take, we share them online on our website and on our social media pages. So if you're in here you're online, you've given us the consent to post anything that you have shared. At this time, I will hand over to Tracy.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Nasim, and good afternoon from a very hot and warm David Livingstone Birthplace Centre today. It's absolutely beautiful day. And Takulandalani to our colleagues who are also joining us from Malawi as well. My name, as Nasim said, I am Tracy Morse. I'll be the chair for today's roundtable. And as well as being lucky enough to be involved in the research project that you're about to hear about, I'm also a trustee of the Scotland-Malawi Partnership, who are very kindly hosting this event for us today. We're particularly delighted to be at David Livingstone's birthplace, which those of us here today have had the privilege of going and visiting already. A really perfect location for us to look at this roundtable as we explore the history of fisheries in Malawi and the important ties between Malawi and Scotland and the influence of colonial versus Indigenous management and expertise. We're particularly excited to be joined by our colleagues from Malawi and Mzuzu University, who I will introduce properly very shortly. I want to say a special thanks to Sandra and the David Livingstone Centre team, and also to David Wilson, who for organising today's event. The work you'll hear about today, I think, is truly an excellent exemplar of a dignified research partnership and a real credit to David's excellent leadership. So the focus of our attention today is on Lake Malawi, and over the next hour or so, we're going to try and take you on a journey through the fascinating historical and environmental research undertaken by the team of historians and scientists from Strathclyde and Mzuzu universities, working hand in hand, of course, with fishing communities as well along the shores of Lake Malawi. Before we meet and hear from the experts in our research, we wanted to take a little time to set the scene for those who are perhaps less familiar with the setting. So Lake Malawi is Africa's third largest lake. It takes up a fifth of the country's land area and is fondly known by many other names, including the Lake of Stars and the Calendar Lake, as it's 365 miles long and at its widest part is 52 miles wide. It's a vital source of food security and livelihoods for millions of people across Malawi, Tanzania and Mozambique, and home to hundreds of fish species, including endemic cichlids, making it one of the richest fish species lakes in the world. Today, the lake employs over 50,000 fishers who harvest over 100,000 tons of fish every year. And in addition to over 500,000 people are indirectly employed in the fishery value chain, supporting another 1.5 million dependents. And being landlocked, Malawi is highly dependent on this lake, which supplies 90% of the country's fish catch. And although the contribution to the diet of Malawians has declined from 70 to 20% over the last 30 years, and this decline is largely due to the rapid increase in population and about over 90% decline in fish stocks since the 1990s. Population growth has also led to degradation of the environment around the lake, the need to use wood and other biomasses for cooking and energy supply, also causing deforestation and siltation. And there's also widespread pollution of the lake from poor environmental health services, my particular interest, around water, sanitation, waste management. And the lake is often used as a source of drinking water, a bath, and at times a toilet. And we also have the increased use of inorganic chemicals for agriculture around the lake as well, which are entering the water system. So in a current world where we seem to be learning very little from the past, we wanted to look to history to help us inform the future of management of Lake Malawi environment and fisheries and similar contexts. We were building on research that we'd previously undertaken in fishing communities and had a fantastic opportunity for funding through the UK Research Councils. From the very start, this was a collaborative piece of work. We reached out to Professor Wapumo Wafu at Mzuzu University, a revered historian in the country, and he introduced us further to colleagues Elias Chirwa and Bryson Nkhoma. And together we built a team of humanities and science experts that really identified this unique opportunity to compare and contrast stories and history of the fisheries management from the mid-20th century in the lake. We wanted to look at a comparison of general colonial fisheries management, an example of traditional fisheries management at Mbenji Island, and also focus on the understanding the local context rather than imposing external solutions, and honouring both Western scientific methods and Indigenous knowledge systems. So enough from me. I want to now pass over I need to click the thing. No, it's not working. There we go. I want to pass over to our experts that we have around the table today to share some of the work we've done so far. David Wilson is a senior lecturer in history. He focuses on maritime, legal and environmental history and within the context of British colonialism between the 17th and 20th centuries. That's quite a long time period, including the subjects of piracy, fishing, trade and coastal communities. We also welcome Dr. Bryson Nkhoma, who's a professor of history at Mzuzu University, where he specialises in African environmental and agricultural history. He's undertaken research on migration and diplomacy, irrigation, farming, peasant agriculture and food security, and of course, as we'll hear today, hidden fisheries. And he particularly enjoys using archival research and oral histories, again, which we'll hear more about today. Charles Knapp is a reader in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Strathclyde. His research examines how bacteria and other organisms work together in the environment using advanced lab techniques to understand how these microbes can help clean up pollution, cycle nutrients, affect human health, and tell us what's happened in the past in these situations. And last but not least, we're delighted to welcome Wellman Kondowe, who's a senior lecturer in African languages and linguistics, also at Mzuzu University. He's also the current lead author of the National Ecosystem Assessment Project, focusing on the Indigenous and local knowledge systems for terrestrial wetlands and aquatic systems. So perfect to tail off our roundtable presentations today. So on that, I'm going to hand over to David to tell you a little bit more about the project.
Thank you so much, Tracy. And yeah, thank you everyone for being here today to hear us speak about this project. Lake Malawi, as Tracy said, is home to a wide variety of fish, and given that we are at the David Livingstone Birthplace Museum, I thought it was apt to start with a quote from David Livingstone, who said during his first visit to Lake Malawi in the 1860s that, quote, an abundance of excellent fish were found in the lake and nearly all were new to him. These sustained lake fishing communities for centuries. But during British colonial rule, the nature of these fisheries began to significantly change, particularly following the arrival of thousands of troops during the First World War, which encouraged increased fishing activities around the Shiri River. The market opportunities provided through this influx of troops encouraged both African fishers and European settlers to expand their fishing operations. I don't know if I can go to the next slide. Oh, to the next one. Perfect. Oh, one more, sorry. There we go. By the 1930s, the most productive settler fishers were the Greek Giannakis brothers, who had migrated to Malawi from the island of Limnos in Greece. By 1938, they controlled a major commercial operation, initiating trawling operations in the southeast lake, mainly targeting tilapia, which are known locally as chambo. Their catch exploded from 74,700 fish in 1937 to over 1.76 million fish in 1943. So a significant expansion in quite a short period of time. Lakeshore leaders complained to the colonial government that these settlers were encroaching on their fishing beaches without their permission, and that their activities were impacting fish populations in the lake. Reports that the Giannakis brothers were filling petrol tins with caviar during the breeding season didn't help their reputation much. Concerns over increasing pressure on fish stocks and potential social upheaval prompted two very different management responses in the mid-20th century: the colonial government's science-led management regime and the customary chief-led management regime at Mbenji Island. In our project, we aim to explore why these regimes had led to drastically different outcomes. One a patchy and weak management regime, and the other celebrated widely today as a model of sustainable management. In my part of the conversation, this talk today, I'm going to give a brief overview of our research surrounding the colonial regime, before then passing over to Professor Bryson Nkhoma to discuss Mbenji Island as well. So, following these complaints by Lakeshore leaders, the British colonial governor began pushing for scientific surveys to assess the state of fish stocks in Lake Malawi and advise on the future direction of the industry. Between 1939 and 1955, three major scientific surveys were commissioned, deploying British scientists to the lake to assess fish stocks and advise on achieving what they refer to as the maximum sustainable yield. That is the maximum yield of fish that could be harvested each year without damaging fish stocks. The most dramatic findings came from the second survey, led by Dr. Rosemary Lowe between 1945 and 1947, which suggested that the crucial chambo fisheries of the Southeast Lake were already being fished to their absolute limit. The solution that each survey team suggested was to bring these fisheries under greater colonial management and oversight. To quote Rosemary Lowe, the easiest way to make the fullest use of all the fish stocks on a long-term basis would probably be by having unified and government control over all separate fisheries. Now, here's where one of the major issues emerges that we started to discuss in our project. Each of these scientific teams relied heavily on African fishers' knowledge, with fishers providing information about fish behaviour, seasonal patterns, and effective fishing techniques. But scientists then folded that knowledge into their reports that were used to create regimes, regulatory regimes, that excluded the fishers and lakeshore leaders from decision-making. Following these surveys, what emerged in the final 2 decades of colonial rule was a patchwork regime that centred on managing a single species in the lake, the chambo, using incomplete data from a handful of monitored beaches, while the vast majority of lake fisheries operated completely beyond governmental oversight. So there was no real data or management of these fisheries from the colonial perspective. Colonial regulations mainly targeted settler fishers. A 1-month close season was imposed on settler fishers targeting chambo in the southeast arm every December, and this was later extended to November, when a continuing decline in catches suggested that this had not actually worked. African fisheries, meanwhile, continued to be portrayed as underdeveloped by the Colonial Fisheries Department. This ignored the reality that African fishers were also rapidly adopting and adapting new technologies and techniques throughout this period too. By independence in 1964, this patchy and fragmented centralised system had proven unable to monitor lake fisheries and had done little to stem continued expansion in the Southeast Lake. It was increasingly disconnected from the evolving realities of lake fisheries, and this disconnect deepened after independence. In 1993, the same year that single-party government collapsed in Malawi, so too did the chambo stocks of Lake Malawi. This failure, paired with external donor pressure, led to a shift to participatory fisheries management, but these approaches were still being designed at a government level with external consultation, continuing to neglect existing customary structures and local power realities. And this reveals the core problem with the centralised systems introduced during colonial rule, and that still persists today, in which external blueprints were imposed without any real adaptation to local contexts or existing institutions. Despite claiming scientific management, the system operated on incomplete data and unrealistic assumptions of governmental control over complex social and ecological systems. Meanwhile, alternative management approaches maintained by fishing communities around the lake were either ignored, sidelined, or undermined, neglecting a critical source of knowledge and leadership in fisheries management. There is hope, however, over the past decade or so, the government of Malawi has begun to implement programmes that seek to meaningfully decentralise management approaches. A long-awaited review of the Fisheries Act is currently ongoing in Malawi, following a successful pilot of community-led fish sanctuaries. But fish stocks continue to be sustainably threatened by overfishing, weak enforcement, pollution, and climate change in many areas of the lake. The fundamental question that this history poses is one we're still grappling with today. Who gets to decide how we manage natural resources, and whose knowledge counts when those decisions are made? Too often there have been these same repeated patterns of imposed external blueprints which have worked to disregard those communities whose collaboration and endorsement is vital to achieving the intended goals of sustainable management. We can see this when we look at what lakeshore leaders achieved using their own measures, which have proven more effective at maintaining healthy fish stocks locally and more peacefully as well. I'll pass over to Professor Bryson Nkhoma now to tell you more about one of the most successful of these regimes.
Yeah, thank you very much, Deputy, for the part you presented it. I'm Bryson Nkhoma. I think I'll take you through the history of Mbenji Island Fisheries, which is bringing us together as one of the most successful regimes when it comes to fishing on Lake Malawi. As a researcher, I focused on oral histories, of course, plus archives from the Malawi National Archives. But as mentioned by David, I think the significance of oral histories cannot be underestimated because initially when we tried to look at the archives, you find scant information on Mbenji. Because what the archives are doing, they're giving us a broader picture of colonial fisheries management, but they're not emphasizing on what's going on at Mbenji. So that's why we had to rely more on oral histories from that area. And then what we did was to interview about 24 elders from Mbenji Island, and this included members of the main committee, which is headed by Chief Makanjira himself, and then the subcommittee at Mbenji Island, which is looking at the operations of Mbenji as a regime. But we also interviewed some fishers around the area. We also interviewed some government officials, especially from the Fisheries Department in Salima. But apart from that, we also attended, I think, the opening and closing ceremonies for Mbenji Fisheries, because generally they open in December. They close in December, but they open in April. But these are ceremonies that are organized by the chief. So by attending those ceremonies, we were able to capture so many oral histories that are narrated, I think, during the ceremonies. We also organized a workshop where we brought together so many people, and they were able to tell us more about the Mbenji fisheries management. So in terms of the results, what we need to know is that Mbenji is an island on Lake Malawi, and then it's located within Salima, under Chief Makanjira, who is the chief, who is managing the regime. Now, fisheries in that area started in the 1950s officially as a commercial center. But before that, people were just doing some localized fishing and so on until the 1950s, after a visit of two fishermen. I think we're talking about Kalemba Asani and Mr. Kampung. And these people were going to Mbenji to look for places where they can do some fishing. Unfortunately, in Mbenji, the colonial government was in control, so they chased them away from fishing. And then they ended up at Mbenji Island. They discovered there was a lot of good fish, especially utaka, which was very common at Mbenji Island. And they informed the chief that this place seems to have good fish and it has a big potential for fishing and so on. And then after the harvest for that year, there was a bumper harvest, and the Chief Makanjira was shocked that there was a lot of fish in his own area. So immediately after that successful fisheries, that's when Makanjira decided to take control of that island and establish a regime for fisheries, and they introduced some rules and regulations to control the management of that fisheries. Among when you look at the rules that were established, they were not necessarily focusing on fishing. They were going beyond fishing. Apart from fishing, I think he was also regulating the moral behavior of people plus the settlement of people in that particular area. But in as far as the fishing was concerned, the key rules included like a total closure of fishing, particularly from December, I think, to April. Unlike a government where they would only close from November and in December. And what normally happened during that closure, all the fishermen are chased away from Mbenji. So there is nobody here for 4 years, and then for 4 months. And then there is a community police, which is introduced on the lake to chase away whosoever is trying to trespass. So that has been a key factor towards the success of Mbenji. But apart from that, there are also some other moral regulations that are introduced. And one of the most funny part is, I don't know, in terms of gender, women are not allowed at Mbenji. So you don't find any woman at Mbenji. I don't know for what reason, but that's what is happening. And again, drinking is not allowed at Mbenji. It's a sober community. People are just busy doing. And then because it's a stone area, toilets are very difficult to find. So you find some floating toilets that are there. But I think it's protected and it's also controlled by the regime. But one of the fascinating parts is rules regarding conservation. So there are some rules regarding conservation. You don't cut any tree, don't threaten, because there are so many snakes in that area. So don't kill any snake, because according to them, these are spiritual. So you don't kill any animal, you don't kill any bird and so on. Now, this Mbenji as a fisheries regime was not recognized until the 1990s. Even during the colonial period, the government was not aware of what was happening. They were operating as a local fisheries management regime until 1990. 1990 it becomes easy because during that time there was issues of decentralization, democracy, and so on. And when I interviewed the Chief Makanjira, he said it wasn't an initiative from government; it was an initiative from him. He had to contact the government to recognize Mbenji as one of the successful fisheries management in the area. And then the government accepted it and recognized. So much that there is now an interaction between government and the local community. So while the chief is regulating, the government also is given a chance, I think, to monitor what is going on and so on. So I think that's about Mbenji. But when you look at the success, I think there are 3 factors we can look at. The first one is that's to do with charismatic leadership of the Senior Chief Makanjira. Is the most revered and respected. And whatever he says, people follow. So because of that, everybody is afraid of him, and then they're giving respect to him, and nobody can trespass because of that type of leadership. To me, I think the other factor has to do with the strict regulations. Because when you compare with the government regime, nobody can trespass in TM Makanjira's area. So I think those strict regulations are also helping to achieve a success of fisheries in that particular area. But apart from that, I think there is also issue of traditional beliefs, because they look at Mbenji as a spiritual place, and you don't trespass. And because of that, they are able to control, they are able to fish, and they are able to produce. Because according to them, for example, when they are opening in April, they organize a sacrifice. So the chief will go there and offer sacrifice to appreciate what God has done to them, what their ancestors done to them, to give them abundance of fish. So that's a belief which is there. And then there are so many traditional dances that are happening around that area. And then the most important thing is when they are opening and closing, the chief has a symbolic key. And so during the closing, he will use that key to close that place. And then during the opening, you also use the same key to open it, to open the place for people now to go and do some fishing. So this is why there is a lot of success. And in fact, because of that, Chief Makanjira is well known in Malawi, and the government is using him as a model for the management of fisheries. And I remember, I think there was a time where all people from all over around Lake Malawi are sent to that area to learn what is happening and so on. And Chief Makanjira, again, I think has been traveling all over. He has gone to, I think, to Japan and so on. He has been invited to make some speeches about the success of Mbenji Island. So briefly, I think that's what I can say about the histories of Mbenji Island. Thank you very much.
Okay, excellent, Bryson. And it's actually very interesting. I'm Charles Knapp. I'm the environmental scientist, or actually one of the, few environmental scientists on the project. So I'll talk about one of the key things we wanted to figure out. One is there a difference in the conditions in the environment between the fish from Mbenji Island, which is under the traditional leadership, versus the fish in the shorelines, which tend to be colonial inspired or government led. In particular, looking at the differences in the fish, but also the environmental conditions that may actually impact the fish. So please, next slide. I think I've already said that. But anyways, the first slide here was actually led by Elias Giro, who's unable to be here. So what he did is he compared a couple hundred sites, looking at the environmental conditions, as well as a couple hundred fish samples that you took, particularly looking at their total length, their body weight, and their length weight ratio. In terms of the water quality, was examining things like temperature, dissolved oxygen, fish need to breathe. The ZSD is a Secchi disc. That is a measure of how clear the water is. So if there's a lot of particulates, obviously you will not see much depth. But if the water is clear, you can see further down, that is the measure of the water clarity. pH, acidity, alkalinity, as well as, this basically the conductivity, total dissolved salts. SRP is phosphate, which is a nutrient that tends to cause eutrophication of lakes or surface water. That because that will cause things to grow, such as algae, which is an increase in chlorophyll. So I'll give you some explanation as the parameters that are being examined, and they all have an impact on the fish. Now, what was discovered when comparing these water sample stations and these physical chemical parameters is actually there was not much difference in the water quality. However, what was found, the fish were completely different. In terms of the, things like their body dimensions, the fish were actually more plump and actually had better growth in the Mbenji Island area than around the shorelines, which tend to be more slender. So there is actually a suggestion that the management strategies, the more localized traditional methods, actually have a positive impact on their fish stock. Next slide, please. So a lot of the things that was mentioned, such as the seasonal controls, allows the fish to breed and obviously the populations to grow. They have control, and a lot of it is based off of the knowledge of the community knowledge of the fish, knowing their life cycles and what they need to actually properly propagate and grow. And they have stringent enforcement, greater surveillance, possibly a greater passion of what's happening with the waters, and have more closer relation with the environmental conditions and the fish. But anyways, ultimately, as you can see here, the fish caught in Mbenji Island tend to be heavier, basically greater yields as food. So anyways, next slide. So I personally was interested in is looking at the conditions, which often can be reflected in the sediment. And I originally was taking sediment in terms of layers, because obviously things pile up in terms of the sedimentation. So things that tend to be at the bottom or towards the bottom tend to be deposited earlier in the past. Things that are more recent along the top. And I kind of want to get a sense of how trends or conditions change over time. It's a complicated thing and doesn't necessarily work very well, but anyways, it was a nice attempt, but I still have a story to tell. I unfortunately was not able to get much sediment from Mbenji Island, but what I can say is what's happening along the shorelines, particularly the 3 locations. Second Bay, 4-1, 4-2 is, Demira Bay, as well as, South. Hard.
Whatever that's out.
Thank you very much. Apologize for the
No, that's
mispronunciation.
fine.
But anyways, those three locations, I basically was looking at the sediment. Next slide, please. But anyways, in terms of metals, quite often it can be an indication of pollution. Fertilizers, inorganic fertilizers tend to put a lot of metals because they come from basically ores dug out of the ground. But truthfully, a lot of what I was seeing is the key metal concentrations that was reflective of the geological conditions in the area. However, things were kind of popping up and with a slight sliver of copper in the top one there. But anyways, nothing really quite stands out. Obviously, I can get into the finer details, but there are some indicators of, pollution, particularly from, industries and agriculture. But anyways, next slide. I also was looking at the microbes, particularly the bacteria. So what I can do is actually extract DNA from the sediment. And from the DNA, I can actually do the DNA sequencing and actually put names to the bacteria that are actually residing in those areas. Unfortunately, a lot of the bacteria that I'm finding is that green bar prevalent is that gamma proteobacteria, very technical term, but they tend to be bacteria associated with human and animal waste. So it's not a very good sign when it's actually the most prevalent, and you got that prevalence of the bacteroides, which is also kind of related to the gut bacteria that might get discharged into the waters. And then from there, it gets a lot of the soil related bacteria. And I have also looked at specific pathogens, but there is an indication is that particularly from the combinations of a bit of the metals like the copper, and more evident is the bacteria, that there could be risks to the food stock related to the fish. Particularly some of these are pathogens, not just to humans, but also to the fish. So there is possibly an emerging food or water concerns. Next slide. I was also looking for evidences of things like amoeba, because amoebas, they can actually infect humans, but they also can infect fish, particularly amoeba gill disease. So that's another possible concern to be aware of. And that I could tell from the evidences is that there are higher prevalence in things like in Sanga Bay, but also higher prevalences in more contemporary layers of the sediment. But anyways, I also was looking at things like antibiotic resistance. If we've got concerns of the bacteria and possible pathogens, are they susceptible to basically drug therapy such as antibiotics? Means basically, could we treat the diseases? Or are they resistant, which means the bacteria will resist the impacts of the antibiotics, therefore it makes it more difficult to clinically treat people, or also if you're doing aquaculture, treat the fish. And there has been, through the evidences of the sediment, has increase of antibiotic resistance amongst the bacteria in these waters. And that's a reflection of not just, human impacts like such as antibiotic use, but from further research and other areas I've done in the past, it's also a reflection of pollution. Pollution stresses bacteria. Bacteria feel that stress. They will start exchanging genetic information. That includes antibiotic resistance. So that could also be as a reflection of basically deteriorating environmental conditions, as well as what people might be or animals discharging into the waters. I think that's it. Next slide. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, colleagues. So I'm Wellman. I didn't really take an active role in this project. Actually, I worked as a translator, and also I also worked on the subtitling of the video. But I coincidentally, it happened that I was also working on another project. So I found that a lot of similarities between what this project was doing in relation to what I was doing at that particular time. So I'm Wellman Kondowe. I'm a lecturer at Mzuzu University, a senior lecturer. My area specialty is linguistics. Yeah, but I'm also working on the indigenous knowledge systems, especially by doing lessons from the NEA, the National Ecosystem Assessment, which we are currently doing in Malawi. Yeah, so my presentation is not really directly like findings of this project, but it's something that will build on what colleagues have already presented, especially from the historical side. Some of the issues Prof. Bryson have already presented, so just build on that. So it is believed that approximately 65% of the world's land is owned and used by indigenous people and local communities. So we can see that the indigenous people occupy a very big percentage of the world's land. Therefore, it is very important that their knowledge systems and their values must be incorporated, especially when we are looking at policies. So we need to weave the indigenous knowledge systems in the ecosystem assessment, but also in this context, fisheries management, because the indigenous people, they possess significant knowledge, innovations, and practices of the surrounding biodiversity and the ecosystem. So every time they look at the ecosystems around, they attach certain knowledge, for example, the multiple values that they have towards what they see around nature and different biodiversity. They also have experienced changes over time. Okay, this is more historical because they have lived the nature, so they're able to tell how things used to be and how things have changed over time, and also the matters of intergenerational transfer, knowledge transfer systems and practices to say how were the older generations handling some issues in this context of fisheries and how they could interpret nature in relation to the fisheries. They are also resource users. They're direct beneficiaries of the resources. They are also right holders. They own quite a big percentage of the land, as I said already, and also they're custodians of the environment. They also possess cultural practices which are important regarding understanding colonial, contemporary, and fishing practices. So in this context, as Professor Bryson said, that Mbenji Island is to be a spiritual island. And this has been passed on from one generation to the other. And that has helped a lot to understand the fisheries from the colonial up to the contemporary practices. As a result, they can recommend best practices which are workable and which are not workable, especially when you look at the community-led solutions. If we're looking at the bottom-up approaches, we need to therefore engage local communities regarding on how they understand the ecosystems, how they've handled the fisheries, and which practices have worked for them, and which ones are not workable for them. And all this knowledge is important, especially for new policy direction, to say how better can we involve the local communities. Otherwise, if we impose solutions that are only science-oriented, neglecting the indigenous people, most of these policies may not be accepted, especially when it comes to implementation stage. Right, so there are a number of lessons that can be drawn from how the indigenous people and local communities have interpreted fisheries management, and especially for sustainable use. So I will talk about the Mbenji Island, which Prof. Nkhoma has already hinted on, about the ancestral belief that the people have. Okay, so it is believed that sometimes when we go to fish at the Mbenji Island, sometimes we meet ghosts, okay, and sometimes we meet a naked woman at the middle of the night. So that belief on its own it also scares people from overfishing. Okay, so I cannot go there to fish on my own at night because I'm not getting to meet this. So because the belief of those value systems, it reduces fishing, and therefore the population of the fish get enhanced. But also it's believed that whenever you see a snake, you mentioned about that Mbenji Island is a home of snakes and a lot of bait. So once you kill a snake, it is believed that there will be violent storms on the lake, and that you need to offer a sacrifice for those storms to cool down. So everyone grows up that kind of fear to say that no, you cannot kill any animal, you can't kill any bird. Doing so, we're going to anger the ancestors, and there will be violent storms, and then there will be no fishing. The whole community is going to be affected. So this has also assisted regarding maintaining the biodiversity. Right. So as a result of this, that's why Prof. Nkhoma said that Mbenji Island has very tasty fish. It has a lot of species, and the fish size is so big compared to other species because of this belief system that sometimes can limit people from overfishing the way they want. Similar to that, there's also a belief that I'll go beyond Lake Malawi. I can also talk about the other lakes because these indigenous knowledge systems they cut across different community of practice. So at Lake Chilwa, this is a lake. It's the second largest lake in Malawi. We're located in Zomba, which is the oldest capital city of Malawi. There's also a belief that once your wife is pregnant, you cannot go fishing. Okay, so the community members could say that if you go fishing while your wife is pregnant, you're going to bring bad luck to fellow fishermen. Okay, so but in the process, that belief helps to minimize the number of fishermen on the lake. So imagine if you have maybe 6 or 7 men whose wives are pregnant at home. So those will be limited from fishing for the next 9 months. So that also reduces the kind of fishing on the lake. And some places like Chaone and Chigampiri, these are islands at Lake Chilwa. These places are historically said to have very thick vegetation, okay, because of the belief in the spiritual reverence. So it's an island and it's well protected. It's the home of spirits. So people cannot just go there to cut down trees. People can't go there to vandalize or to destroy nature because they believe that it's the home of ancestors. And if once you do that, you're going to anger the ancestors. As a result, it has become a home for a lot of fish species. For example, the catfish, the chambo, and also the small called the matemba. They like hiding at Chaone because it's a place that is not really tampered regarding fisheries. Right, and it's also believed, like this one we got from Kazuni. Lake Kazuni is located in the north of Malawi. It's within the Nika National Park. So it is believed that some animals or some fish they can carry cases, they can, and also that some can carry blessings. Okay, therefore, some fish or even some animals are being protected from being killed unnecessarily, because once you kill those type of animals, they can bring bad luck to the community, and also the ancestors are going to be angry. So that has also restricted fishing, but also even some animals like the hippos. There's a lot of hippos at Lake Kazuni that have been maintained or preserved because of those cultural belief systems. There's also a belief system in lake in river Ndwone. River Ndwone is located in Chile Valley. Okay, it's believed to be the blood of Mbona. Okay, Mbona is a very big figure in Malawi, especially from the Sena speaking communities. They believe that Mbona is the ancestor, is the one who carries their message. Apart from Jesus, they believe in that. So he was killed by his brothers and he was buried. So his blood became the river. Yeah, so there's also a story behind what happened with the head, because they believe that his hair became the forest, which is known as Kuluvi. and people don't cut trees in Kondowe forest. It's community-led forest, which has really stood out to be a very good case study regarding indigenous forest system, regarding the terrestrial management, on how people attach themselves to natural resources and how that protects vandalism of resources. So the Nkhoma River, there's a belief that when we're fishing that river, you don't have to catch more than 3 fish. Okay? Yeah, so when you're fishing, the maximum you can get, it should be 3, maybe 4. If you try to overfish, you can even catch a fetus. Okay, you can catch a fetus, or you can even catch something crazy that you never thought of. So everyone who goes there to fish is being scared to say, okay, fine, I've caught how many fish? 3. Oh, let me stop here, because when I proceed, I'm likely to catch a human being or a fetus, you know. Yeah, so those belief systems have helped regarding the controlling fisheries, and they have been sustainable, and have helped communities to manage the fishing resources very well for the current and also for the future generations. So when I looked at this project, I found that a lot of indigenous knowledge systems, especially being revealed in the histories, in the history narratives. So finally, I want to say that the indigenous people possess a large and impressive storehouse of local knowledge systems. They have innovations and practices about the biodiversity and ecosystems, and are better placed to contribute to the conservation. So I think projects of this nature, we need to understand the belief systems that are rooted in the indigenous people. Their identities, cultures, and livelihood are often deeply intertwined with their surrounding biodiversity and ecosystem, and the services and benefits that they offer. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Wellman. If you could put the next slide on, please.
So thank you for listening to our presentations today. We just have one final sort of slide to discuss, and that's our key learnings from the project itself, which have been hinted at across all of the presentations. But just to go through this briefly, our main thing really is that the successes in Mbenji Island are a result of the collective elements of the management regime, so that the technical aspects cannot be simply isolated and applied elsewhere. So we couldn't just take the full closed season of fisheries at Mbenji Island and then try to apply that elsewhere without all the underlying sort of enforcement, the underlying beliefs and the underlying knowledge. That would just be another imposition, which they have tried in other places. It just hasn't worked because it lacks local legitimacy and local embeddedness. As we've heard, really the regime at Mbenji Island is rooted in the power and the character of Senior Chief Makanjira, and really it's through his legitimacy and his strength and his enforcement, backed up by his committee, that really this continues to thrive and be such a successful fishery. We also need to think about how management regimes connect to each other and also to local communities as well, because actually part of what we found with this project was that some of the success of Mbenji was that during the close season, those who wouldn't move to agriculture or other industries would then fish in another part of the lake that was under government control, so sort of was less enforced. So actually the lack of enforcement in government waters helped the successes at Mbenji Island. And we said we need to understand that, because if you try to create the same close season throughout the whole lake, then it might actually then impact on the successes at Mbenji. So there's something to be done there about timing and about trying to think about seasonal closing rather than blanket closing as well. I mentioned the idea about leadership, but what's also key here is this idea of communication. So through the ceremonies that Bryson mentioned, really these successes are communicated, but so too are anyone who's infringed on the actual practices themselves. So if anyone has fished during the close season, then they are sort of named and fined and sort of made an example of for the community. And that's really important, just to continue that idea of there is repercussions to this, to not fulfilling the beliefs and the needs of the fishery. And that communication is vital. So often in the sort of government management regime, there isn't much in the way of communication of enforcement, or in the way of why these rules are implemented or when these rules are being implemented, but also the consequences of actually going against these regulations as well. On that, there also needs to be more support, greater support for community management. by providing tangible resources. From what we've heard from Mbenji Island, really there isn't much in the way of actual government support, except from the fact that they celebrate it as a sustainable fishery. In terms of resources, at one point there was a vessel given to Mbenji Island and was provided for their enforcement, but that vessel is no longer sort of operating and there hasn't been a replacement. So really that Mbenji Island regime is continuing on its own, sort of celebrated by government, but without the resources being provided by the government. And if we're going to make this sort of successful elsewhere on the lake, if community-led management is going to be successful, we really need support from government as well. And this is my bias coming in because I am a historian, I think we need more historical awareness of these practices, of past management regimes, what has worked and what has not worked, and why has that been the case? But also, how are these past failures continuing to impact on our present management context? Because even if we're sort of moving towards a more participatory approach, a more sort of legitimate approach to management, what's happened in the past continues to create tensions between communities and enforcement agents and government. You can't just sort of get rid of that by creating a new approach. You need to address those past issues and past injustices if we're going to move forward together on an equal basis. And that's kind of our key learnings from the project. We're hoping to extend the project further and to look at other contexts in Lake Malawi and other community-led management regimes as well, some of which Wellman has discussed as well today. So here's hoping that we can do that. But for now, I will close out there and pass back over to Tracy for the...
Thanks very much, David. And I think maybe go to the next slide first, and then we'll come back to Q&A, just to say, because I think there's been a couple of mentions of films as well, which Bryson mentioned about the closing ceremony and opening ceremonies. And there's a fantastic short film that Wellman mentioned. He'd help with some of the translations and subtitling and things on that too, which is a great opportunity to see these things in action and see also the personalities and characters and the leadership in action as well in that process. And we've all discovered that Bryson is going to be the next National Geographic presenter. He's absolutely excellent. And if you're in Scotland and you want to come and see that, the David Livingstone Centre has it on film as well. So please do come. You can also access all these things through, and we'll put the QR code, and I know that the slides will be shared after this as well. So please do visit the fantastic website that David has put together with all of the different historical papers and content and maps and so much interesting and rich information in there. Okay, so then moving on, sorry, thank you. Actually, we can maybe just get rid of the screen, thanks. I'd like to open up for any questions that anyone has. So welcome those that are online, either to put them into the chat if there are any, or to put up your hand. Feel free to ask, or we can pick on Agnes in the room as well. So these two lovely gentlemen, if they have any questions.
Yes.
As usual, I have some up my sleeve. So I was actually, David snuck in a few things about the questions that I had earlier. But I was actually thinking when Wellman was talking there, obviously we're struggling with what climate change means right now for all parts of the world. And trying to understand, and you know, the parameters and what's happening seems to be accelerating more and more. Malawi is hugely affected by climate change and increased extreme weather events. I'm wondering how, from a historical perspective, and our historians and linguists in the room, how can we really bring Indigenous knowledge and these different ways of knowing into building proper adaptation solutions that are sustainable? Because also these communities have never lived through this environment right now as well, right? So how can we embrace some of these ideas to try and look at how we almost tackle the unknown in the future with what might be coming? Really easy question to start you off with, right? Here we go. Bryson, should I pick on you first?
Yeah, I think it's very important because all along we know science has brought so many answers, I think, to the question that we have as a community in the environment and so on. But there is a limit to which science can answer the questions. And that's why I think we are advocating that we can tap from the local knowledge and so on in terms of sustainability and so on. And as mentioned by Wellman, is looking at the communities most of the land is owned, most of the assets are owned by the local communities, and we cannot keep them away from the management. We need to integrate. So what it means is science and local knowledge should integrate. So where there is a science implemented, we also need to bring in the element of community knowledge. Because, for example, in the case of Mbenji and Mbenji Island, those people, they know where to find more fish, when to fish, and how to do it. But that knowledge is generated from their own experiences and so on. So those who bring in scientific regulations into that area may not have that historical background, may not have that that understanding from the local people. So I think when the two work together, then we'll be able to achieve sustainable management of environmental, just to start anyway. But it may be David or Wellman.
All right, fine. So maybe the first thing to understand is to decolonize the term climate change, because maybe the local communities may not really understand what we mean by climate change. It's a Western term. So possibly maybe we have to unpack it to say what constitutes climate change regarding the local people's understanding. So if you talk about climate change, we would be talking about droughts, for example. We're talking about the delays in rainfalls and the like. Those are maybe the signs of climate change. And then now we cannot run away from looking at the terrestrial, the forest and the like. So fine, so they understand that maybe the first approach would be how do the communities manage forest? Because if the communities have their own knowledge systems on how they conserve the forest, then that would be one way of combating climate change. So as I said, that the communities have their own value systems that they have, and they all attach meaning to trees that they see around. So for them, they will avoid cutting a tree because they see value in the tree. They will not avoid the tree because of the climate change. It's because this tree is a source of medicine. This tree gives us early warning systems. When we see these flowers, then we know that the rains are close. If we see this type of leaves, it means this year there will be drought or there will be hunger. So in as far as they understand, they attach meaning to the behaviors of trees. And then those behaviors help them to conserve the trees. That would be one step towards fighting climate change. But also, we should also understand how the connection to the ancestors, it also helps a lot. Because the communities in Malawi, largely they believe that their life is controlled by ancestors. So in terms of how they handle graveyards, in terms of how they worship the ancestors, they actually believe that if you want rains to come in good time, we have to go and worship at the shrine. So we have Kluvi, as I said. We have Sinja, is it Sinja in Lilongwe, a shrine, where these are some of the shrines that people go to worship. And they go there to worship because they want rains. So you see that all these are connected to climate change. And these systems have worked for the people from past until now they're even practicing them. And also they know that they have belief systems that once we anger the ancestors, there will be floods, there will be calamities, there will be droughts. So that respect into the ancestors is one way how the communities understand climate change and how the effort that they do to combat climate change. So that's how I can respond at this particular time.
That was a very good response. Thank you so much. That was absolutely perfect response. I don't know if anyone wants to add anything else into that.
Yeah, I mean, I can. I don't think I can as well as you both did, but I can try. But I think the way that I always look at it is about telling narratives. So I think the most important thing about adapting to climate change and understanding climate change is telling a good narrative. It's kind of the way to get people to think about it and to engage with it more is to tell a good narrative and to have those narratives rooted in people's everyday experiences and lives. And I think that one of the things we need to remember about Indigenous knowledges and local community knowledge is that it's not static, is that it is always changing and always adapting and always being built and changing. And I think if we can look at it from that perspective instead of, sort of like, here's climate change, what does Indigenous knowledge say about that? Instead, saying, well, what is Indigenous knowledge saying currently about different events and things that are changing? How is that changing over time, and why is those knowledges changing? Is it a result of climate change or other events or other processes and contexts? And I think just engaging with communities' own experimentation and observations over time can help us to understand their perspectives on what we would probably call climate change, but what they might refer to as something completely different. But if we can tell narratives through that lens and sort of engage with those narratives, I think that it's not only useful for engaging with communities, but I think it's also engaging with the broader public as well, because, we've known about climate change for decades and it has been suppressed. There's been lots of politicisation around it, but it's getting people to care about it, and the only way to get people to care about it is to tell a narrative. It's like David Attenborough and the turtles with the straws. Like, that is the narrative you need. You need people to engage with it in that way. And I think if we can do that and understanding how narratives are being disrupted because of climate change, we can start to really build up a sort of storehouse, as Wellman says, of stories and how that's changed over time. I don't know if that makes any sense. But...
Absolutely. No, I think it makes great sense, and just as applicable to here in Scotland as it is in Malawi, right, around these challenges as well. We have a question. Oh, Stuart's got his literal hand up there. That's not even a virtual hand.
Thanks, Tracy, and thanks all for the fascinating presentations. With the economic pressures of daily life in Malawi, are the communities managing to respect the closed seasons that they know will promote sustainable fish stocks, but at the same time have got families to feed right now?
Good one.
I think right now Bryson's wishing Elias was here.
Yeah, thank you very much, Stuart. I think it's quite an interesting question. We've been thinking about it, and I think it appeared in several places. To me, I think let's say, remember there are still two regimes, one by government and the other one by Mbenji, by Chief Makanjira. So what we have learned is the government regime. I think the closure is generally November to December. While the Makanjira regime, which is Mbenji Fisheries regime, I think the closure is from December to April. So we have learned that there is an interaction. When the government regime is closed, especially in November, Mbenji is still open, so they are able to survive through Mbenji. Now, when Mbenji is closed, the government regime January is open. So what we have noted is fishermen from Mbenji, after a total closure, they will migrate to the government part, and then continue to do some fishing and so on. That's a mechanism the local people have developed to survive that period of crisis, the economy, and so on. But at the same time, I think the narrative is they close Mbenji from December to April. During that time, they encourage all the people to go into the agricultural area where they can continue farming and so on, so that they don't lose much. So towards the end of April, they are harvesting and they are surviving through agricultural production. Then once Mbenji is open, now they go to the island and continue fishing. So to me, I think the balance of the two is helping the people to survive economic crisis and so on. So people are very clever. They know how to manipulate the system and then survive from crisis and so on. I think that's briefly what I can say.
Thanks, Bryson.
Just on that, I think I remember from some of the research that you had done as well, is that there is some negotiations at times as well where people can also sort of can fish it in Mbenji during the close season if there's a negotiation. Is that right?
Yeah, you've reminded me a very important aspect. Generally, we got appeals from the fishermen. For example, let's say in January or February, when people they have nothing to use to survive, they negotiate with Chief Makanjira. So there are some more emergency opening, maybe for a week. So Mbenji can be opened within that closure period, just for a week or two. And then people are allowed to do the fishing within that week, and then they are chased away, just to make sure that they manage and the so there is that flexibility. But it has to be through Chief Makanjira. Nobody can just go. They will negotiate with the chief, and the chief will approve, and then for a week, it will be temporarily opened, and just to make sure that people survive and eat cope.
Yeah, which I think is such an important aspect, because it speaks to that point about communication as well. As there is someone they can speak to and negotiate with. Because when it comes to the government close season, it's often sort of more sort of shut. So you can't have that negotiation. You can't sort of negotiate a time to open, because there's not the mechanism there to do that. Whereas at Mbenji Island, there is that mechanism. There is that ability to speak to them, to Makanjira.
Yeah, but also, even though there can be that an emergency opening, it's not that every gear is going to be allowed.
No, yeah.
Yeah, so there will be selected kind of gear that is allowed. So usually they will allow the bigger net size. So you can only catch the big fish isolated, so that at least the smaller ones can also grow. I like Kazuni, what they do is that you have to apply for a permit. Apply for a permit. So you are given a permit to go fish, and that permit is just for 1 day. So once you fish, then maybe for 1 week or 2 weeks, you can be given another permit. So it's just allowed for people, at least they can manage the small protein that they can afford, but not for commercial. Yeah.
I had a follow-up question to the question that Tracy asked on climate change. And the response that, especially that came from Wellman, talking about ILK and how people, local communities understand climate change. I was just wondering the extent to which this local knowledge and the local knowledge and systems are incorporated into policy and practice within Malawi, because I think even though they may be known at a local level, but if they're not incorporated into policy, it might be difficult to implement them. I don't know what extent the local knowledges and practices incorporated at policy level in Malawi.
Unfortunately, our policies are very quiet, and especially all the environmental related policies. The Wildlife Park, the Land Act, almost all, they don't talk anything about the indigenous knowledge systems, which I feel like is a gap which projects like this, I think they're intending to address. Yeah, they're quite silent, and it has been science. So maybe we have to take that decolonial approach to say which practices are workable to the local people. Because some of the things that I talked about, the climate change, do people in the village understand what climate change is? They want to really understand. But if you have to unpack that for them to understand bits and bits of climate change, and then look at what solution do people have in place when such issues happen. Okay. We can also talk about the fishing itself. Okay. To say it's not all the time when all the fish is available to fish. Like some types of fish will be available at a particular season, and at some point will disappear. Others will come during only the rainy season. Others will be only during winter, summer, and the like. Yeah. So maybe the question would be how do communities adapt in times where there's no that kind of fish at that particular time? Because you cannot be a fisherman, an expert in all kinds of fisheries. Others are just good at catching usipa, others are just good at catching chambo, others are good at, yeah. So the communities have their own ways of how they adapt regarding when those issues happen. They have their own ways of how but the community, the government will not understand when they don't involve their knowledge and their practices into policies. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe I can also come in. I happen to be privileged, I think, to be part of a team that has been engaged by government to work on the Malawi state of the environment, I think, which will appear in the 2026, because right now we're using the 2010 state of the environment, and I think it's outdated. And then one of the issues raised and has been emphasized is to integrate indigenous knowledge, because they have discovered that we're failing to manage the environment because the local knowledge has been kept away from the policies and so on. And then attending the meetings, there is a strong emphasis that every part, every section, there must be a way by which indigenous knowledge can be integrated. So almost every chapter, every section, they're creating space to see how indigenous knowledge can be integrated and used in the management of Malawian environment. So I think there is some hope. Possibly most of the policies, environmental policies, will have a section on integration of novel knowledge. And I think they're treating it as a cross-cutting issue. There is no section on indigenous knowledge, but almost every part should include it. And I think they have engaged someone, should be Alice Campbell, who is an expert, I think, for indigenous knowledge. To make sure that the whole policy, the whole document is responsive to indigenous knowledge. And so to me, I think that would be a way forward.
Actually, there's that movement now in Malawi. Like every policy has to incorporate indigenous knowledge systems. Yeah, and Alice is spearheading that.
That's really exciting. And as we're moving forward with new ideas for the project, I'm sure that's going to be incorporated more well as we go on. I'm going to give everyone a chance to just tell me. So we've spoken a lot about the actual content of the research itself, but I think one of the best parts of this project for me has also been working with different disciplines and new people and different individuals. So despite, living in Malawi for 20 years, I'm always learning something new every day. And that's been a real treat for me working with you all. I would like you all, Wellman, you can be excused, but you've also worked on this a wee bit, so you can find one. What has been the highlight of the way of working that we've had within this project for each of us? So not necessarily about the science itself, but about the kind of what have you got out from building these new relationships, partnerships? Because I know for most of the team, it's been didn't know each other before this project. So I'm going to start with Charles, because he's got to be quiet for a long time.
But yeah, no, I mean, this was a rather interesting project because quite often I see scientists, they always have their questions and they go out and they generate numbers. And sometimes you kind of look at it and say, what is the relevance of all this? And then it's almost like they're trying to, after the fact, figure out the relevance. But here it's really kind of interesting is just to hear the stories, hearing the ideas, and then just letting them kind of just brew a bit. And then just like, wait a minute, there is a science question here that could be investigated. And it's something that's just kind of like more grassroots evolved rather than just dictated from above by some grand idea or a buzzword or something. It's just everything just kind of grows organically, naturally. And then the investigations just natural to that. And yes, there are some numbers, but they actually come from something that's actually relevant.
Great, good answer. You're gonna follow that up, guys. Wellman, did you want to give us something? No, you're typing out. Bryson, what about yourself?
I think this has been quite an interesting research project. Interestingly, when we are starting, I had a lot of questions, doubts, and so on, because here is a situation whereby we're emphasizing on integrating science to explain humanities. So to me, I think it was quite shocking and scary. But then we brought areas who is purely a scientist. And then most of us are historians. And we had to work together to get best results. But I like the interface between science and humanities. For example, I specialize in oral histories. Maybe David focusing on the archives from London and so on. And then the areas is focusing on the scientific nature plus Charles. So what was happening is from oral history, we're saying Mbenji is a success. And then we're emphasizing on beliefs, myths, and traditions. And then areas will take samples from them. Let's go and test them or send them to Charles to prove. Then the funny thing is, science now was able to explain what is happening. So it's not just beliefs. And I think that's what I've learned. It's not just beliefs, it's not just tradition, because beliefs are empty. There is nothing they can explain. But to me, I think that that ability for science to explain what the belief is trying to do, to me, I think it makes a lot of sense. And so we think that they are protecting because of beliefs, but there is science behind those beliefs, and that science was proved by Charles, and then the language is the same. So we have a fatty fish, and then you go to the lab and explain it. So it's more than, so what I've learned is the beliefs are helping science, I think, to achieve its own goal within that context. So to me, I think that's the most important part, where you can get humanities and science to explain, or we can understand the belief from a scientific perspective. So to me, I think that's the most interesting part I've learned from this program.
Oh, Wellman's got something there.
I'll choose to be different with them. Choose to be different, to say that science is there to prove the beliefs. Okay, no, we have to look at them as two different knowledge systems, which can be proven differently. Okay, science has its own way how we validate hypothesis. Humanities have also our own way of how we validate hypotheses.
Yes.
So if you look at the histories and the indigenous knowledge systems, these cannot really fully be proven by science. Okay, but they can work hand in hand. They can complement each other. Okay, for example, if you're talking of, let's say, trees, say this tree is a medicinal plant. It can heal cancer. Okay, that science can prove that, but traditionally the community has already validated that. So the major player in terms of validation of indigenous knowledge or histories is the users themselves. Okay. If they say we have a connection with the ancestors, when speaking to our ancestors, they hear our prayer. Science cannot prove that. Okay. Yeah. So yes, you have a point, but I just want to make sure not everything that is humanities and beliefs can be proven by science. These are two knowledge systems which work better when they are weaved, when they're integrated together.
And that's what I love about a round table, and nice bit of debate as well within there.
Yeah, there is a level where science cannot explain beliefs.
Yeah.
But there is a level where science will now label that belief. For example, if they say this tree has some aspects that are able to heal cancer,
Yeah.
and then the scientists will take that tree, go to the lab, and they will do the test. They will find that there are some elements, some scientific elements that are part and parcel of the healing process of cancer. So I think in that context, it's able. But I think there is a certain level of belief where you go into magic and spiriticism.
It's absolutely, yeah. Great, over to you, last but not least, David.
Yeah, no, I think it's been a really interesting project, and I guess to start off with, like as Bryson sort of mentioned, mostly I work in the archive with dusty documents, and that's where I'm happy and comfortable. It's in the archive with documents that are historical, but this project has really helped me to sort of challenge that, and also just learn from the dialogue. Even this dialogue right now is just testing these ideas and then challenging these ideas and seeing like how do they actually play out between us as we have these conversations, and how can that shape research. That's what's been the most sort of rewarding for me, but also just all I've been doing for the past 10 years of my career is talking about colonial disruptions and local realities and how they sort of sometimes talk to each other or sometimes don't talk to each other. But actually with this project, it was because of your work, Bryson, you were able to speak to communities and gain the oral histories and see how they connected or completely disconnected from the colonial record. And then with the environmental science work to sort of understand where those contexts are in dialogue with each other, or indeed not in dialogue with each other. And just actually having the time and the people and the expertise in the room to test these ideas has just been really a really beautiful thing, I think, and just really sort of eye-opening at what is possible when humanities and sciences come together in a way that isn't to test each other or to verify each other, but as a way to come together equally and with respect for each other and start to learn from each other with the communities themselves as well, understand what science they want to see and what knowledges they want to elevate. I think there's that reciprocal dialogue is what's been really good about this project. And I think the call that we had, the UKRI call that we went for, the hidden histories of environmental science, really allowed us to do that. And there's just not enough funding calls out there that really are genuinely put out to have that dialogue and reciprocity between different disciplines. Quite often you can see it's meant to be like by one discipline and then the other disciplines to feed in, rather than there being a more of a full conversation. So that's kind of what I've loved about the call, the project, and just working with all of you, which has been amazing. And now you're in Scotland, which is great. This is the first time that we've met Bryson and Wellman in person, despite 3 years of working together very closely. So that's been exciting as well.
Goes to show the joy of technology now as well.
Yeah.
What we can achieve without flying around.
Yeah.
Fantastic. So I'm just gonna kind of wrap up now, I think, if that's okay. So, you know, I think what we've hopefully done along this little journey over the last hour or so is kind of give a story of two paths in one way. So one kind of that idea of one that's imposed from the outside, from a colonial rule, perhaps struggled over times with legitimacy and sustainability, which is also the key of what we're trying to achieve here. And another that's kind of grown from within the community, still thrives today and offers that flexibility and adaptability that you're talking about, you know, about opportunities in times of stress and things as well. And I think that we're really cognizant in this group. I know I'm preaching to the converted in this group about, you know, we're looking for solutions that emerge from local voices and not ones that are imposed from the top up, in that idea of sharing power and opportunity equitably. So yeah, just to finish to say, you know, that idea of partnership, whether that's in order to achieve the sustainability of Lake Malawi or in order to achieve great, informative, impactful research, is really something about coming together to help drive these solutions together. So great, I want to thank you all very, very much for your time. And thank you so much to the David Livingstone Centre for having us today.
Yes.